Henry VIII is known for being a notoriously brutal king, who ordered the execution of dozens of thousands of people within his kingdom. These executions even included some of the king's closest friends and allies, including two of his wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. One of his final victims would also be a Howard, who would suffer Henry's paranoid mind, and at around the age of 30 would meet his end on the block at Tower Hill in the final days of Henry VIII's reign. Join us today as we look at the brutal execution of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, Henry VIII's last victim, and remember to support our channel. Please make sure to subscribe. Henry Howard was born in Hertfordshire around 1517, the eldest son to the incredibly influential Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk. His father was a wealthy politician and a key player at court, and would in fact be the uncle to two of Henry VIII's wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Henry was also descended from King Edward I on his father's side, and also Edward III on his mother's side, and he was raised in a high-class manner. He was brought up at Windsor Castle, alongside the illegitimate son of Henry VIII, Henry Fitzroy, who was even at the time considered by some to be a possible heir to the king. Henry Howard would grow close with Fitzroy, and also later became his brother-in-law. Howard would then go on to serve in the King's French Wars, as a Lieutenant General of the King on sea and land, fighting like his father would for the king. Henry Howard had since around the age of 7 become the Earl of Surrey, and in 1532 he would accompany his first cousin Anne Boleyn, King Henry VIII and the Duke of Richmond Henry Fitzroy to France, and he would stay there within the court of the French king, Francis I, for a year. When he returned, however, he was noted for being rather childish, and he also had a short temper. He was a rather reckless man who would engage in bitter arguments with members of court. He was even once imprisoned for hitting a courtier and walking through the streets of London, aimlessly breaking windows of people's houses whilst the occupants were sleeping inside them. Henry was also noted to have been a rather talented poet, and was also a man of culture, becoming friends and close with Hans Holbein, Henry VIII's royal painter. It was said how he sat for Holbein more than anyone else. The Earl was part in 1536 of his father's efforts to suppress the Pilgrimage of Grace, a protest that had arisen in the north of England against Henry VIII's dissolutions of the monasteries, with the pilgrimage gaining a huge amount of traction and support. The rebels would march into York, and Henry would place his trusted soldiers in charge of putting down the uprising. It would later be claimed that Henry Howard would instead be a supporter of the rebellion, and for this Henry VIII would hold him at Windsor Castle, and during this time in custody he would become hostile to Thomas Cromwell and some of the king's closest advisers, before being released. 1537 would be a huge year for the Earl of Surrey, and not all in a good way. His friend Henry Fitzroy, the Earl of Richmond, would pass away at the age of 17. Anne Boleyn would also be executed on charges of adultery, treason and incest. He was also a father of 2 by this point, with his wife Frances Howard giving birth to a daughter first and then a son. In July 1542, Henry Howard was then sent to Fleet Prison for challenging another man to a duel, and he was also a close friend of Cardinal Reginald Pole, who was forced to live in exile in fear for his life. Pole's mother Margaret, the Countess of Salisbury, had been executed earlier in horrific scenes, with the elderly lady being beheaded inside the walls of the Tower of London. On the 7th of August 1542, he was released from prison, and 2 months later would accompany his father on a venture into Scotland, which resulted in the burning of Kelso, a Scottish border town. It was when he returned to London that he would take part in the reckless behaviour on the 2nd of February 1543, running wild through the city of London, breaking the windows of churches and grand houses with their stone bows and throwing stones at the ladies of the Bankside stews. Howard would later defend himself in a poem, saying he did this to warn the citizens of London against their impending doom. Howard would then embark on many military expeditions. In October 1543, for example, he was sent to help the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in a campaign in northern France, and Howard gained plaudits for his fighting abilities. He would then take part in further battles in France, with one huge defeat for him occurring in January 1546 at Saint-Étienne. His soldiers and forces were underpaid, underfed and lacked a great degree of motivation. His soldiers would even flee the battlefield under his leadership, and it was claimed that Howard would even consider falling on his sword and ending his life for the shame. He was then replaced and summoned by the Privy Council, as Henry VIII had heard reports of Henry's treachery and mismanagement. Henry Howard continued to mix with religious reformers, but his behaviour had caused concern for a long time. The Howards, both Henry and Thomas, would have little consideration for the new men who had risen to power in court, and they made many enemies within Henry VIII's court. This coincided with a time in which Henry VIII was gripped by huge paranoia and also thought he was about to be assassinated and usurped. Truth be told, the king was nearing the end of his life, increasingly becoming ill, and he began to become obsessed with the idea that Henry Howard was planning a coup to steal the throne from Henry VIII and his future son Edward VI. Howard had allegedly claimed that his sister, Mary Fitzroy, the widow of Henry's deceased illegitimate son Henry Fitzroy, should seduce the king, her father-in-law, and become his mistress in order to manipulate and influence the king. Mary herself would refuse to do this, saying she would rather cut her throat than do so, and this caused a huge falling out. Howard would even quarter the royal arms of King Edward the Confessor, which was considered a huge disrespect to the former king. With suspicion arising, in early December 1546, Richard Southwell would come forward with evidence that proved Henry Howard was involved in a conspiracy against the king, and with this he was arrested and held at Ely Palace. He would then be interrogated here heavily, but would refuse to give away any information, denying any guilt of a conspiracy. After a few days he was taken to the Tower of London and held here before his trial began on the 13th of January 1547. Putting this into context, 2 weeks later the king would be dead, and at the time it's possible to consider that the arrest and threat was all manufactured by Henry's paranoia and also his illness and failing health. Nonetheless, Howard was placed on trial and throughout the whole day would continue to deny guilt, even after several of his former friends would testify and present evidence against him. His own friends, it's considered, would turn against him as they feared that as good a friend as he was and how fun he was, his temper and personality unsuited him for power, and that as a ruler he would be deadly. Henry Howard would be sentenced to death for the crime of quartering a royal coat of arms, which alleged him being guilty of high treason. He had displayed the arms of Edward the Confessor on a shield he had painted, which was something only King Henry was allowed to do. In one corner of the shield, it's alleged that Howard had a direct claim to the throne. Some historians do claim that the Earl was set up, but it wasn't difficult for Henry VIII to convince the Earl's enemies to agree with him on imposing the death sentence upon Howard. Both Henry Howard and his father Thomas Howard would be sentenced to death. However, his father would be incredibly lucky, escaping execution as the king would die a day before the appointed execution date for Thomas, and he remained imprisoned, but the same could not be said for Henry Howard. On the 19th of January 1547, Henry Howard was led out of the Tower of London for the short walk to Tower Hill, the site of execution that would take the lives of so many of Tudor England's most famous people. He had spent the last days of his life writing and paraphrasing the Psalms, and he would feel betrayed leading up to his execution, yet he stuck by his religious beliefs. Henry had also written to the king during this time to try and escape his fate, but the only sparing move the king would do is commute his death sentence from hanging, drawing and quartering to a simpler beheading. He walked from the tower to Tower Hill, where the scaffold greeted him, and a crowd would have been waiting for his end. The executioner would have also been there to greet the Earl, who wasn't spared the privacy of a private execution within the walls of the Tower of London. In front of the crowds he would have addressed the crowd before the executioner would make his customary remarks and preparations for the final act of Henry Howard's life. In front of a crowd on the 19th of January, Henry Howard was beheaded, using a sharp axe in front of a crowd, bringing an end to the Earl of Surrey's life. After his death, his remains were removed and later interred at Framlingham in Suffolk, but as mentioned, his father, who was due to suffer the same fate, would in fact be extremely lucky that in just over a week after Henry's execution, the King of England was dead. This made Henry Howard the final victim of the infamous and notorious Henry VIII, who would oversee the executions of thousands within his own country. Should Howard's execution have been put back or postponed, then chances are that he would have been imprisoned throughout the reign of Edward VI like his father, and then released when Mary I came onto the throne. He is a man who was an extremely talented poet, being in fact the first English poet to publish work using blank verse and unrhymed iambic pentameter, a style which Shakespeare would later use. His life and downfall was in keeping with many of Tudor society's greatest who the king would turn against, with the sharp blade of the axe being the final act in Henry Howard the Earl of Surrey's life. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.